Thank you. Welcome back to this afternoon's Planning Board meeting. It's the 23rd of July. We will continue this meeting now with item 8B on the agenda, which is Hillbourne School, Kitchener Crescent in Poole. And I would like to ask the officer, Doug Evans, if he would present the application, please.
Good afternoon, Chairman. It's James Gilfillan, Senior Planning Officer at the Poole team of BCP Council.
Good afternoon, James.
I'm going to be presenting this application as the case officer.
Thank you.
Okay, I will. There we go, councillors. Hillbourne School. Proposal is to demolish the existing school buildings and erect a brand new school, including a replacement nursery, playgrounds, playing fields, 2 multi-use games areas, new parking and access. To give those of you who are not massively familiar with Poole a flavour for where the site is in the context of the wider Poole, you can see there Broadstone towards the top of the plan, Gravel Hill, Camford Heath to the right, and of course then the school buildings on the Waterloo estate circled in red. The existing school, you can see the 2 buildings, and the white area being the grounds that are associated with those 2 buildings. Looking at that in more detail, red line outlining the application site, the grounds of the school, the playing fields, playgrounds, the multiple school buildings, and then you can see from that aerial photo quite clearly the extent of housing around the site being part of that residential estate, and then the sort of ordnance survey plan highlighting a bit more clearly the buildings with the spaces around them. The site is subject to a site-specific policy in the Poole local plan, predominantly a housing allocation policy, but recognising the importance of the opportunity for providing a brand new school and making use of some surplus land for housing development. The policy identifies the principle of a replacement school and a minimum of 40 homes. However, before you today is simply the proposal to replace the existing school with a new suite of school buildings and facilities. Looking at the existing site, the top photo shows the spread and sprawl of buildings across the site, with a nursery at what is actually the southern end of the site, infant school in the centre. You can see the size and scale of the buildings in the photo below it, showing you the infant school buildings, and then the junior school called the Oaks, a slightly larger building, elements of it 2-storey, towards the north of the site, again shown by the photo in the bottom corner, and then at the very north edge of the site is actually a youth club building facility, providing services to pupils, students, children in the area. Some street scene photos, just to give you a context again of the surrounding development. So you can see the low scale of the school on the left hand side of the top drawing. That's looking towards the north, and then the housing development on the opposite side of Kitchener Crescent. And then the photo at the bottom of the site, that's looking down from the north. Again, you can see the relationship to houses, the scale of the houses, and then the school buildings on the site and their position in relation to the Kitchener Crescent. So looking at the proposals for a new school, a significant constraint over this development has been the importance of preserving the existing school operation, education services, attendance by pupils, whilst a new school is being built. So through analysis of the options available, the proposed school building is being located in the centre of the site, sitting between the existing 2 buildings. You can see from those images how that would allow the majority, if not all, of the existing buildings to remain in situ whilst construction is undertaken, then allowing pupils to transfer at the appropriate time into the new buildings, and the old existing school buildings to be demolished. Now, ultimately, this might not have been resulted in the best layout of the use of the site, efficient use of the site, but as a constraint regarding the continued occupation and presence of pupils on the site, it was the only solution available to the development project team. With the demolition of the existing school buildings, the new school playing fields and mugger facilities would be able to be delivered. So looking at the proposal in its entirety and its detail, the drawing on the left shows the footprint of the existing building highlighted in blue, and the drawing on the left now, the drawing on the left here is a more detailed layout of the proposed school. So you've got classroom block, preschool, entrance facilities, staff facilities, school hall, mugger, second mugger, car parking, and a grass pitch, and the remaining playing fields and tree belt at the rear of the site. The image on the other side of the screen puts that in a bit more context of the existing whole site. So here, turning to a bit more detail regarding access parking arrangements. Several entrance points into the school onto the grounds, new vehicular access point to the car parking, pedestrian pupil staff entrance, and direct entrance in for the preschool. As I was saying, there are preschool classrooms, entrance, and the hall, and the two muggers. 30 parking spaces provided on site with space for minibuses, and then extensive cycle racks, scooter racks for pupils in this area of the main entrance, main access for those users. Architecture, design, very contemporary buildings, appropriate to the use, making a statement in the street scene. Clearly at odds with the prevailing pattern and character of the area, but it's a school with a different use, and important that it makes a statement in the street scene. The larger elements, two-story classroom, set of classrooms here, and then the larger building here being the main hall with its additional story height. You can see through the cross section here the height, floor to ceiling height, being greater because of that use as a hall, whereas here you can see the two-story element to the classroom block. Rear view, obviously replicating similar palette of materials, proportions, design elements. What's pretty difficult to pick out is elements on the side elevations. There's the hall, doesn't extend as deep as the much larger classroom block element, with a single-story kitchen element at the rear of the main hall. And then on the northern side, you've got the smaller preschool building and the larger classroom block behind it, as shown on this elevation. Turning to the uses, the facilities, to say the larger classroom block extending deeper into the site, preschool area, entrance facilities directly related to that main pedestrian access point, and then the hall. You'll see from the report and the conditions therein that as part of the disposal of the site and the smaller size of the school, Sport England have invited the scheme to be made available, or facilities within the scheme to be made available to community clubs. There's already an aspiration to maintain the youth club that's already on the site, and you can see from the layout and the design of the site how the school hall that would lend itself to use by youth club and community groups would be directly adjacent to one of the muggers and accessible from the car park on site and the vehicle access point. So designed with that opportunity in mind, however, as you'll see from the conditions, formalised arrangement needs to be designed once the school has had chance to get up and running. Turning to the other floors, further classrooms on the first floor, and a staff room, no accommodation in these elements of the school, and then the void that I described on the first floor with the higher ceiling height of the sports hall. Briefly, the roof plan showing solar PV panels on the appropriate roof slope. As you'll have seen from the photos and seen here on the photos on this image, there's an extensive array of dominant, prominent, mature trees back of the site. These are largely unaffected by the proposals, certainly existing, and the proposed new build would avoid any direct impact upon them by way of the buildings. There is a small number of trees to be removed from this area, which is circled in red here, and a little group of trees here, again circled in red, in order to provide some of the playing pitch facilities. As you can see, there are 7 trees to be removed in 2 groups. Over the size and scale of trees that are forming the backdrop to the site, it's not felt to be a significant issue, or certainly a constraint against the development. Some very important or prominent trees along the frontage here, as you can see in these aerial photos, are to be retained and accommodated by the development, preserving that contribution to the street scene. School is incorporating biodiversity enhancement, not only through the retention of this large sweep of trees at the rear, but features such as tawny owl nest boxes and insect biomes, as well as landscape planting, 16 new trees located around the edge of the site, and then a landscaped area for pupil play within the playing areas of the school. There'll also be retention of hedgerow along the frontage, quite a prominent feature of the site at present, and establishment of additional trees as appropriate. They're putting the whole proposal in some 3D context. You've got the floodlit mugger towards the front of the site, the car park, the hedgerow extending along the frontage, and there you can see the extent of the buildings proposed on the site. So the school brings forward, it's a 2 FE form of entry school, years reception through to 6. That gives a capacity of 420 pupils, and that's the same as the existing combination on site at the moment. The 2 muggers and the grass pitch, improved facilities, improved quality facilities, considered sufficient to satisfy the requirements of Sport England and meet the requirements of the age groups on the school, pupils at the school. It would include the preschool and youth club opportunities and community club use. It'll achieve BREEAM Very Good, and ultimately will be significant enhancement in the energy efficiency of the existing buildings, based on their age, the sprawling nature of their layout, and the nature of energy, hot water heating production, and insulation that's in those buildings being somewhat dated. So the application is for a new 420 pupil school, replacing the old outdated schools. At this stage there's no details, no elements of residential. As with the policy set out earlier in the presentation, that will come forward at a future date. So any representations you may have received or seen that refer to residential development, that's not before us today. The scheme is recommended for approval as set out in the case officer report and the addendum sheet. However, unfortunately, there's been one late procedural matter come to light. That means the recommendation needs to change to delegate to the head of planning services to wait for the expiry of a certificate notification based around Scottish and Southern Electricity having a sufficient interest in the application site that they need to be notified of the application by the applicant. That has been undertaken, but does not expire for 2 weeks into the future. So pending the expiry of that notification by the applicant, the recommendation is as set out in the report and the addendum sheet circulated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. So over to those in objection. There are none. And in support, we have one written statement that I will ask Democratic Services to read out from a Jane Locksmith. Could we have that done, please, Joe?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Thank you very much. You're quite right. We have only received the one public statement that is in support of the application from Jane Locksmith, who is the Managing Director of Cube Design and is the agent acting on behalf of BCP Council for this application. Her statement is as follows. My name is Jane Locksmith and I am the agent acting on behalf of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole Council for the development of a new two-storey primary school at the site of the existing Hillbourne Primary School on Kitchener Crescent, Poole BH17 7HX. The application has been subject to a detailed assessment with your planning officers and included a pre-application, which was originally submitted in 2018, public consultation which took place in 2019, and the subsequent planning application that was submitted at the tail end of 2019. The application provides much needed educational facilities in state-of-the-art accommodation on the site of the existing school. Feasibility studies have been undertaken to locate the most appropriate position for the two-form entry school, and the centre of the site has been chosen for the proposal. The design of the building is sympathetic to the location, it is contemporary in design, has a mix of materials which are durable as well as colourful, and will contribute and respect the natural habitat of the site. Longevity is critical to the selection of the materials. Landscape has been retained, and the strong landscape edge to the site is a key factor of the design proposals. The car parking is located to the side of the development and hidden behind the significant and mature landscape that is being retained. The proposed scheme will have a sprinkler system and has been designed to meet all current building regulations and statutory guidance. The facility will provide a main hall, dining facility, classroom provision for 420 pupils, together with a preschool and nursery accommodation. It will also provide a base for the youth centre to use. This proposal is part of an overall master plan, which is being developed for the site and incorporates the development of the adjacent site for housing, which is not part of this application. On the matter of areas and COVID-19, we are aware that there are significant discussions relating to school accommodation and their design following the COVID-19 pandemic. We have been advised by Tim Johnson, the design advisor at the Department for Education, that our proposals should meet and demonstrate compliance with the department's output specification, and we can confirm that this has been undertaken accordingly. There are currently no planned changes to the permanent Department for Education standards and specification to the pandemic. That is the end of the statement in support, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So, members, we will go over to yourselves. But before we do that, Councillor Butt, you indicated that before you became a substitute on this panel, you were going to speak as a ward councillor. Would you still like to do that, or would you like to continue as a member of the panel and then do your statement while speaking on that?
Yes, it boils down to exactly the same, Mr. Chairman, so I will leave the choice to you. I'm saying exactly the same thing I would as a ward councillor appearing or as a member of this committee.
Thank you, Councillor Butt. In that case, I will come to you first to kick off the debate.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. The proposal is a rebuild of Hillbourne School, and it definitely meets modern standards. The existing buildings are being obviously no longer fit for purpose. The land is already designated as education land, so there is no change of use. Although the site of the application excludes the existing school buildings and some playing field land, the area does meet DEFRA guidelines in terms of size. The old school will continue in operation until the new buildings are ready to be occupied. We've already heard from James Gilfillan as to how that process will work, and I'm grateful to him. As is expected from a council application, the standard of documentation, design and attention to detail is sound and well documented. There will be provision for a youth club, although sadly it will not enjoy a separate dedicated building as at present. With regard to street scene, The buildings will inevitably have a different appearance from the surrounding residential properties, as did the old school, but it will not be overtly dominant at 2.5 stories, with some traditional and some modern elements. There will also be new housing to be built on both sides, which will serve in time as a buffer in terms of styling. Traffic. There will not be any increase in number of pupils, although drop-off and pick-up will still be on the street, and I'm very pleased to see that a green travel plan is being prepared. With regard to environment, some trees will be lost due to construction, and this is a concern of my residents, but a replanting scheme is proposed. There will be some landscaping at the front of the site. Rediversity, various bat boxes, hedgehog houses, etc. are proposed, which is all well and good. However, concerns have been expressed about loss of hedgerow habitats, which are well used by small birds, insect. By their very nature, they must be. The loss of Category B tree is disappointing, but the benefits of the scheme are deemed to outweigh their loss. Furthermore, many A category trees are retained across the site. An arboricultural method statement has identified the alignment of protective fencing during construction to protect against this. Landscaping is to be retained on the frontage to Kitchener Crescent. Clearly, any habitats removed should only be undertaken outside the nesting season, which I believe is March to August. Floodlighting is proposed for the 2 muggers, and the proposals include shields to prevent light scatter onto future adjoining residential properties. Particularly pleased with the addition of the 2nd mugger, with community access to this and the school hall amenities. The site is prone to some flooding, it always has been in heavy rain, and land levels are being set to keep such flooding away from the new buildings. Moving to construction. During the construction, the site will be safeguarded to protect pupils who will still be attending school on either side. Extremely important. Routes for construction traffic are well planned, and deliveries to be scheduled to avoid school start and end times. Demolition of the old buildings will only be carried out after the new school is completed and occupied. So in the main, the proposal is extremely sound. However, Mr. Chairman, please can you confirm the following 2 very small points. That drainage, especially to the front of the site, is adequate for such heavy flooding events, which are likely to become more common. This provision must address any funneling floodwater onto adjoining properties or the road. And that given the concerns of Mr. Pollard's report in the documentation outlining his fears as to the permanent harm to the biodiversity regarding loss of hedgerow, etc., that this committee, Mr. Chairman, is assured that there is adequate provision for appropriate retention and replacement of appropriate hedgerow. So therefore, in conclusion, this new school build project has been a long, hard journey. A generation has actually grown up from first new school build inception to planned delivery, and their children now attend the infant school. As this sits before the committee today, it is by no means a perfect proposal, as Mr. Gilfillan alluded to, being smaller than present provision with a housing development compromise in order to fund the build. We also see loss of green space and potential harm to specific habitats and species. However, that said, with the appropriate assurances as requested earlier, Mr. Chairman, this proposal does represent a significant improvement, benefiting the school and the wider community. It will provide a desperately needed fit-for-purpose school, and at a later stage, together with the pivotal local housing, will, I trust, in time, settle into the surrounding community of Hilborn and Waterloo as a positive enhancement to the local area. Therefore, Mr. Chairman, as a ward councillor for Creekmore, Hilborn and Waterloo, this is what I know many hope will be the fruition of decades of work to achieve a new build school for Creekmore, Hilborn and Waterloo. Thus, I'm very pleased to strongly support this application as a lasting benefit to the local community. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Butt. Members, Councillor Diane Butler, who is also a ward councillor, has requested to speak on this. She had not indicated before to Democratic that she wished to do so, but I am minded to allow this if other members are in agreement on this. Could I, if I have no RTSs, I will take that as okay.
Agreed.
Okay, in that case, thank you. Councillor Butler, would you like to speak, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. In addition to what Councillor Butt has just said, this is the most beautiful scheme, It's got a lot of very good design qualities in it. My only question is that when it's come back now from the first plan that came through with the second multi-use games area, I'm just a bit worried that the floodlit element might affect the present residents and also maybe some of the new residents that might happen in the next phase of building. So just a reassurance really about the shielding of light scatter, as Councillor Butt was talking about. Maybe if that could just be confirmed, because that's the main reason really.
I will ask the officer to do that. Do you have any other comments to make, Councillor Butler?
No, I mean, I was very impressed when I went to the presentation that was given in Hilborn School. It was very well done. The buildings are very creative. A lot of the land is being retained quite naturally, making use of the natural habitats, and especially the retention of the front hedge along Kitchener Crescent, which is really important for the screening and the privacy. So yeah, generally a very good development, but as I say, just a worry about the floodlit mugger. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Councillor Butler. I wonder if the officer could clarify that position, please, regarding the mugger and the floodlights.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, in respect of the mugger and the floodlights, sorry, I'm just going to find a better plan. There we go. In terms of the potential disturbance, obviously, I think the councillor referenced, or perhaps Councillor Butt referenced, that any future residential development on this parcel of land I'm highlighting with the cursor will have to be cognizant of that because of the potentially quite close proximity. However, in terms of across to existing residents on Kitchener Crescent, the council's environmental health, environmental protection officers from that kind of lighting nuisance, is content with the concept and the principle of the lighting, and that the spread will be angled in a manner that would preclude harm to them. But we have also included a condition restricting use of the floodlit mugger to 9 p.m. To avoid any potential nuisance from noise or lighting later into the evenings when it could affect the amenity of those neighbours.
Thank you, James, for that. I appreciate that. Councillor Marion Lepodovin.
Thank you, Chair. I must say I'm very happy with this proposal. It's going to be such a vast improvement for everyone involved with the school over the current situation with what were originally two schools at some considerable distance apart, trying to become one school, but with two separated buildings. The facilities look excellent. I like the design, the retention of trees, all that is good. My one concern is that the opportunity hasn't been taken to increase the capacity, given that there will be a minimum of 40 extra houses in the area, possibly more, possibly quite a bit more, and with the growing population and incomers and that sort of thing, I would have thought the opportunity would have been taken for increased capacity. But that's not a matter for us to query. I like the solar panels, although I do wonder why there aren't some on the hall building as well. Perhaps there was scope for even more energy saving. But on the whole, I'm very happy with this, and I will move that we accept.
Thank you for that. Councillor Stribley, would you like to speak now, or would somebody wish to second Councillor Lepodovin's move?
I'll do both, Chairman.
Thank you very much, Councillor Stribley. Carry on, please.
If I may.
You may.
I agree with both of the ward councillors. I think this is an extremely well planned development. I personally think it will be a huge improvement in the street scene from what is now currently what looks from the street scene rather like tatty prefab buildings. There will be a stylish new school set with good materials, lasting long term, and so well set back from the road that it certainly won't be overbearing on properties opposite.
The only thing I find missing on this application or information is lack of information about the 2 new side boundaries to the site. We hear that there is a need for hedgerows. We all know that. There is a need for trees. I'm wondering if there is any possibility on the site itself, on the new side boundaries, for a few additional trees, 2 or 3 maybe on each boundary, so they become mature when the existing trees are starting to fail. Otherwise, perhaps provision of a good hedgerow, something traditional, perhaps like hawthorn, along the base. If there isn't room within the site, possibly the council might consider that a necessity when the adjacent sites will be redeveloped. But I do think there needs to be a connection between Kitchener Crescent and the rear of the site in some green manner, whether it's a fence, a hedge, or a few trees, or whatever. I'm very keen on promoting green corridors, and I think for the future we need to pay a little more attention to that. So if I could have some explanation of what is determined for the site boundaries. Notwithstanding that, I think it's a very good application, and I'm very happy to second it.
Thank you very much. James, would you like to comment on that regarding the trees, please?
In terms of the trees, you might have seen whilst Councillor Stribley was talking, I was highlighting trees in this area here, which are some of the proposed new trees that are along the boundary and could start to contribute to a corridor through to the trees at the rear that she was suggesting, which is entirely an appropriate and sensible strategy. Clearly, the school is relatively built out to maximise the space available to it. And the yet to be designed residential scheme could also improve the landscape planting along the lines that she's been suggesting. Ultimately, the school is going to look to ensure its boundaries are safe and secure. As I referenced in my report and some of the representations raised, security at schools is becoming, unfortunately, a slightly more critical issue. So inevitably they are going to be looking at a secure fence around their boundary, which is entirely reasonable and appropriate. But the addition of landscape planting could be achieved as part of either the proposals for development on the neighbouring land when they come forward. But as I say, the scheme already includes some proposals for landscape planting that we consider is sufficient to support the application.
Thank you, Joe. Councillor Butt.
Yes, thank you. One small point, Mr. Chairman. You were very mindful to pertain the answer for Councillor Butler that she raised with regard to the light scatter. I'd be grateful if you could do the same with regard to the drainage that I raised, that is adequate, and that the concerns of Mr. Pollard's report with regard to the loss of hedgerow that there is. It is said in there that there will be replacement and adequate provision, but I would just like an understanding that this will go ahead, please, as in the same way Councillor Butler raised my point about the light scatter for the mug. I'd be extremely grateful. Thank you.
No problem. Mr. Gillifan. James, would you like to answer that, please?
Yeah. So in terms of loss of hedgerow, sorry, I'm just trying to find a photo that will help us. There are existing multiple access points onto the site that interrupt the existing hedgerow. Where they will be closed up, there will be opportunities for new hedgerow planting to compensate for that hedgerow that will be lost to form the new access points. So in terms of striking a balance there between some lost hedgerow, there will be replacement. And then in terms of the drainage, the council's drainage engineer is satisfied that a sustainable drainage strategy can be achieved. It's known that there is some surface water flooding issues throughout that area, largely following the road infrastructure, but there is an element that crosses the site, running sort of through here across the basically the front gardens, we'll call it, of the site at present, should the severity of storm cause that kind of surface water flooding to occur. However, the school buildings have been designed to be raised above those ground levels. It's only a very marginal increase in height over the existing ground levels required, and certainly accommodated easily within the space in front of the buildings. So in terms of drainage, the council's engineers are satisfied that the solution has been found.
Thank you for that. Councillor Butt.
Many thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to Mr. Gilfillan for that explanation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Is there anyone else wishing to make comments, or we will move to the vote? We have a mover in Councillor Lepodvin and seconded by Councillor Stribley. I have no request to speak. Before we go to that, may I please ask that all members were able to hear the entire conversation that has taken place? We seem to have had a slight dropout of some people during the presentation.
Yeah, no problems here.
None here. I could hear everything.
Okay.
No problem.
Excellent. In that case, we will move on to the vote. So as I said, we have a move by Councillor Lepodvin, seconded by Councillor Stribley. I will call your names in turn. Please indicate on how you wish to vote on this application. Starting with Councillor McCormack, Vice Chairman.
For.
Councillor Bull.
For.
Councillor Bartlett.
For.
Councillor Davies.
For.
Councillor Butt.
For.
Councillor Hall.
For.
Councillor Hilliard. Councillor Hilliard. Councillor Johnson.
For.
Sorry, Chair, it's Councillor Hilliard for.
Thank you, Councillor Hilliard. Councillor Podovin.
For.
Councillor Lawson.
For.
Councillor O'Neill.
For.
Councillor Stribley.
For.
Councillor Trent.
For.
And myself, Chairman, Councillor Kelsey, also for. Thank you for that. Mr. Tyler, could we have the results of that, please?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. So the total number of votes for the motion is 14. There were no votes against and there were no abstentions. So that vote is unanimous in favour of the motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, members. That application is granted, and thank you to James for presenting the case. Moving on, members, as you are aware, item 8C has now been deferred until a further notice. So we will move on with item 8D, which is 115 Bargates in Christchurch, and this is for the change of use of ground floor to an A1 retail use at front with a separate one-bedroom flat at the rear. And this application today is being dealt with by Mr. David Hodges. David, would you like to present, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just to check, I will continue unless anyone indicates that they're not able to see the presentation. So this is an application for the change of use of this unit at 115 Bargates in Christchurch to a shop on the ground floor with a separate one-bed flat to the rear. The site is on the north end of Bargates, just for people's orientation. There's Christchurch railway station there off to the left, and fringes of the town centre on the bottom there, the Waitrose store on the bottom right. The property is part of an existing commercial parade. It's within the town centre primary shopping area and within the designated secondary shopping frontage. The current use of the site as a taxi booking service and, excuse my pronunciation, as a sui generis use, planning permission is needed to revert back to a retail use, as well as for the creation of the residential unit. So the site is here in the red line, and the unit will be an existing rear wing on the back of the property. Slightly unusual arrangement in that the entrance is through a separate entrance off of Bargates through a right-of-way round to the back of the property, which the applicant has confirmed is available. And the bottom right view there, it just shows you the back of the building, which will be converted. So existing elevations here, and the proposed unit will be in this rear ground floor wing. Proposed elevations to add some cladding and obscure glaze part of the windows for privacy in between adjoining units, shown on the proposed elevations here. And so this is a proposed layout. So the former taxi use on the left-hand side, and proposal for the retail unit at front and the residential unit to the rear. So just looking at some photos of the site, unit in the middle here, access from Bargates, as a retail unit within a secondary shopping frontage, clearly acceptable on its merits from our point of view, Chairman, and just show you where the access is through to the rear of the site. Just a few views on the rear. You can see obviously a great deal of residential use of the spaces above the shop units on this stretch, and this is looking at the back, and the unit will be in this area here. Just a couple of close-up views. So the right-hand view there, that's where the unit will be located in that part of the rear wing, and this will be where the access through into the property would be. And just the last couple of views, just to show on this top right, this is the existing access into the upper floor flat in the unit, this brown door here, and they're looking back on this unit, just to show the unit in here with its relationship to the adjoining buildings. And Chairman, you'll see for the reasons set out in the report, we're content to recommend both the change of use and the creation of the unit on this site for the reasons given in the report, and we recommend the application be delegated to the head of planning, subject to the completion of a legal agreement to secure heathland mitigation, and on that basis the application is recommended for approval.
Thank you, Mr. Hodges. We will now go over to any people in objection, of which there are none, and we have one person in support, Mr. Tony Gibney. Mr. Tyler, would you read out any statement, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chairman. So you're quite right. There is just the one public statement which is in support of the application from Mr. Tony Gibney of Cavendish Estates, Dorset. He is the applicant for this application. His statement is as follows. The above planning application, in our opinion, should be granted for the reasons the planning officer has mentioned in his report. We also believe that a quality, affordable property in the Christchurch area will be welcomed at a time when there is a housing shortage in the local area and the country. Added to this, that the council policymakers are looking to have more retail premises on the Bargate, and this change of use from sui generis taxi rank to A1 retail will help them with the current shortage of retail on the Bargates. The conversion works will be carried out by local tradesmen and therefore give local jobs to local people. That is the end of Mr. Tony Gibney's statement. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So over to members. Is there anyone who would like to kick off the conversation on this application, please?
Chairman, Peter Hall, the Ward Councillor.
Carry on, Councillor Hall.
I'd like to support the recommendation for approval. It's on the town centre, it's very close to the town centre, it's on a very good bus route, and it's a very much needed one-bed flat. Proposed and set out.
Okay, are you moving that, Councillor Hall?
I'd like to move it, yes, please.
Thank you very much. Do I have a seconder for that move before I go to other speakers, please?
I'll be happy to second that.
Who was that? Sorry. Thank you, Councillor McCormack. I appreciate that. Would you like to speak?
Yeah, only to say that I don't think this proposal will have any impact on the surrounding areas, and it brings a possibly a unit that could become empty into use. So it's a good proposal.
Thank you very much. Councillor Trent.
Yes, Chair. I'm just questioning initially why this was called in when there didn't seem to be any objections. It was obviously recommended for grant, and there didn't seem to be any refusal. I would have thought that because the recommendation matched the ward councillor's preference as well, that it should have just been dealt with under delegated decision. But now it's here, I think it is useful and promising if it can achieve another retail frontage along that bit of Bargate, and obviously an additional dwelling. And I kind of wish it the best, because retail frontages might be something that is a little bit rarer in the not too distant future. So I welcome this and just hope that it's successful.
Thank you, Councillor Trent. I was actually wondering the same thing myself as to regards why it was actually called in when it was recommended for granting, but we'll sort that one out at another date. Councillor Bartlett.
Chair, I think that there are other people RTS before me.
Yep, you're right. Sorry. Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you, Chair. It might be the reason it was called in. I'll get to in a second. I don't have in principle a problem with the taxi office being converted to a retail unit. What does concern me to a degree is the small flat that's indicated at the back, 25 square metres. It's some 29% smaller than recommended sizes, although I accept that the council does not accept that recommendation. It does seem rather small. Perhaps somebody could throw some light on what the intention is. Is this a rental accommodation or for the shop owner to use? The other thing I would comment, I've spoken to the residents both sides and above the three properties, one each side and above this proposal, and they indicate that they would be quite happy for access, pedestrian access, not just from the back, from 117 alleyway, which was to the left of an earlier shot. But I would like to know more about the proposed accommodation. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Hodges, could you respond to that, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I mean, clearly through the planning system, we don't have control whether the unit is disposed of or rented or kept as part of the ownership of the unit. We're simply here to consider the merits of the dwelling on the site. With regard to the comment on the size of the unit, yes, we note that and we acknowledge that in the report, and you'll see that on balance we consider that acceptable for the reasons as we've described in the report before you.
Thank you, Mr. Hodges. Councillor Stribley.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a query, and looking at the plan in front of us, from what we were shown at the side, the living room is going to have the obscure glazing and the bedroom is going to retain the clear glazing, which seems to be a bit of a nonsense. And if the boundary wall or fence is 2 metres or above, and this is a single-storey development, I guess it doesn't too much matter whether you have single obscure glazing or not, because there will be no direct view in from either side. But it seems rather odd to me that they want obscure glazing in the living room and clear glazing in the bedroom, because I'm sure that's the way around it was shown on the other plan when we saw the glazing.
Mr. Hodges?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just for clarity, looking at this rear elevation, so on the right-hand side, you'll see that you've got clear glazed openings in the rear elevation, what would be the east elevation. So that's also serving that living space here. So that's that clear glazed window here. So there's clear glazing in this part as well as obscure glazing on here. Yes, Councillor Stribby is correct. There's clear glazing showed to the bedroom. I'll just flick through to the photos, and it's just because of this relationship here. Ordinarily, yes, it would be entirely correct if there were a sort of 2-metre high fence or wall between the two properties in this middle photograph. We wouldn't be so concerned, but it's just because of that slightly tight, unusual relationship there, Chairman.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. That's lovely.
Thank you. Councillor Bartlett.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I wish to raise an issue regarding the living space. In fact, the Homes and Community Agency Quality Indicators is adopted by the Council and can be applied in this particular instance. The standard does require between 30 and 35 square metres as a minimum standard, and this at 25 metres square actually makes it between 17 and 28% under the minimum standard. However, and whilst I understand that the National Described Space Standards do not form part or are not formally adopted by the BCP, I think it's not unreasonable to actually take them into consideration because after all they are a national standard and can be used as a guide. And if you were to use that guide, you would see that depending on whether there are 1 or 2 people living in the accommodation would actually dictate a space standard of between, in fact, the space standard would be between 36 and 50% below the minimum standard required by the nationally described space standards. So regardless of which standard you use, if you take the adopted one, it's still considerably under what's required. If you take the national one, it paints a very bleak picture. So this flat is tiny. And in terms of living, the quality of living for people for the future, we're not really taking care of their interests. You know, that's what these standards are designed to do. They're designed to make sure that people have a reasonable space to live in. I don't think it's reasonable to ignore the standards, particularly where they are formally adopted. So I'm afraid this application does not have my backing.
Thank you very much, Councillor Bartlett. I wonder if Mr. Hodges would like to make comment on that, please.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, Councillor Bartlett's correct in identifying the housing quality indicators that are listed in the Christchurch local plan, which apply to the development. We do acknowledge and we do highlight those standards in the report. You'll see that we've given you an on-balance recommendation in respect of that particular issue. In terms of broad terms, where there's a potential conflict with a policy in the plan, that's not automatically fatal to the acceptability of a scheme. We need to judge the scheme as a whole against all the policies in the local plan and also in relation to the advice in the MPPF. And so what we've done is, in our recommendation, is viewed that against the whole benefits of the plan, looking at the emphasis on high density development in these particular locations in the local plan, the accessibility of the site and the reuse of an existing building, accepting that we are below that quoted standard in this particular instance. And the only other issue I just want to clarify is at this point in time, BCP Council would not be able to apply the nationally described space standard because that needs to be adopted through a local plan. We're obviously content that should the local plan process ultimately adopt the nationally described space standard, we would be looking at applying that robustly where we can show we've got adequate supply of housing. But in this particular instance, for the reasons that we set out in the report, we don't believe in this particular case we can sustain a refusal purely on that basis, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hodges. Councillor Bull.
Thank you, Chair. I'm kind of
going over the ground that Councillor Bartlett has just raised, but the accommodation and the space for future residents is just too small for us to really be considering this. I think it's far below what should be acceptable, and I won't be supporting this application.
Thank you, Councillor Bull. We have a move on the table. If there is no one else wishing to speak at this time, we have a move by Councillor Hall and seconded by Councillor McCormack. I will call each member individually as per the norm, and if you could indicate your response, please. So, Councillor McCormack, Vice Chairman.
For.
Councillor Bull.
Against.
Councillor Bartlett.
Against.
Councillor Davies. Councillor Davies.
For.
Thank you. Councillor Hall.
For.
Councillor Hilliard.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Councillor Lepodovin.
For.
Councillor Lawton.
For.
Councillor O'Neill.
Against.
Councillor Stribley.
Against.
Councillor Trent. Sorry, Councillor Trent, could you repeat that?
For.
Thank you. And myself, I am also for. Councillor Butt has left the meeting and will not be voting on this. So could we have the results of that, please, Joe?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Just if you would mind giving me a moment to top that up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. So the result of that vote is the total number of votes for the motion is 9, and the total number of votes against the motion is 4. There were no abstentions, so that motion is carried. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. And so, members, thank you. That application is granted as per the officer's recommendation. We will now move on to item 8E on today's list, which is number 13, Dane Court Road in Poole.
Thank you, Chairman. It's Mr. Evans. Let me just introduce myself for the benefit of those not familiar with me, since I'm afraid I missed the top of the meeting when introductions were done. I'm Doug Evans. I'm a development management team leader.
Thank you, Mr. Evans.
Chairman, 13 Dane Court Road. With you at committee, because of the planning history of the site, this is an application where a previous application was refused by committee, an application for 9 units on this site. And I would ask you to, or I would remind you that the reason for refusal was that the building and the plot coverage, including the car parking, would be dominant and out of keeping with the established pattern of development. There's been a number of changes to the scheme with the intention of addressing those concerns, and I'll allude to them as I go through the presentation. I would, however, remind the committee that you will be considering the scheme on its individual and particular merits. Clearly, the earlier decision is a material consideration, and as I say, I'll draw attention to some of the key changes. However, whilst the scheme is materially different, hence the recommendation for approval, it's not fundamentally so. It is still a proposal for a block of flats, albeit somewhat different, for 8 flats rather than 9. Just put it into context of location, the Parkston area towards the western edge of the borough. And to be more precise in terms of that context, Dane Court Road, to give you some landmarks, Bournemouth and Poole College, just to the south of the site, and of course immediately to the south of Bournemouth and Poole College is Poole Civic Centre. Well, I've got that on the screen. Can I just draw your attention to the application site number 13? We will be moving later in the committee to consider another application at number 15. And if I can just draw your attention to the existing context of that, the wider context of the nature of the sites around it, the substantial buildings that already exist in the street, and that perhaps changed character from one side of the street to the other in terms of scale and, well, character. Some specifics. Top 2 pictures, the front elevation as seen from the street of number 13 and its rear elevation, an indication in the middle there of its rear garden, relatively flat, rising slightly towards the rear, no significant trees close to the element of development, and the side elevation to the east to number 15, that is the side elevation of the adjoining house number 15. That is the subject of the further application that you'll be coming to later in the afternoon. To the west of the site, number 11, this is all of these images, or this image is to the front of number 13, so this is the side elevation with the front elevation of number 11. As you can see also in there, the front elevation of number 13 and the substantial house next door, number 11. Just bottom right hand image, if I just draw your attention to the relationship between the projection beyond the rear elevation of number 13 by number 11 and the absence of principal windows in that elevation of number 11. So the site plan. The purple square is the footprint of the existing house, and again just drawing attention to that setback of number 11 relative to the existing house at number 13. The proposed building would project slightly closer at the boundary and would go beyond the rear elevation of the existing house. Let me just put that back into the context of the rear elevation as it exists and the side elevation of number 11. One of the ways in which this scheme differs from the previous scheme is that in the inset of the side elevation further away from the boundary, creating that greater separation on that boundary. And similarly, an inset on the eastern boundary to number 15. One of the issues previously was the layout of the car parking. I'll show you some comparative drawings if need be later on, but the scheme as now laid out has reorientated the car parking. The reduction in the number of flats from 9 to 8 has resulted in a reduction in the car parking provision from 10 spaces down to 8 spaces. Let me just double check that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which meets the adopted standard for unallocated parking, which is perfectly acceptable in a block of flats like this. So reduction of the total amount of hard surfacing, reorientation to be at right angles from the footway rather than parallel, as it were, to the footway. More opportunities introduced for landscaping within the scheme, with a view to mitigating the impact of the building in the street. To put the elevations into context, top left purple outline shows the profile, the silhouette of the existing house. The revised scheme is significantly different in terms of its architectural approach, a much more a design that fits in more with the age and character of the area, let me put it that way, including such features as dropping the eaves height. The previous building had raised eaves heights to increase the available floor space within the roof. This has lowered those eaves. It has created a design that fits in more comfortably, I'd suggest, with the context. So the right-hand top right image to number 15, the site that you'll be coming back to presently, the rear elevation, and the elevation to number 11, which is the substantial building that projects to the rear at the moment. Just draw attention to windows in the side elevation. Footprint of the building, single access point where the blue star is, 3 two-bedroom flats on the ground floor, 3 two-bedroom flats on the first floor, 2 two-bedroom flats within the slightly reduced usable footprint within the roof space as a result of dropping the eaves height relative to the previous scheme. So putting that into the context of the street, the building that we saw projecting, the house that we saw projecting slightly to the rear, number 11, number 13, you can just make out the height of the existing house and the presence of that in the street. Number 15 that we're coming back to, but just to facilitate your consideration of how things potentially could move on in the area. The lower street scene would be a potential outcome if both of the applications before you were to be approved. Therefore, you can have regard both to the possibility of were you minded to approve this, number 15 remaining as it is, in which case the relationship is acceptable. There is no harm to the amenities of number 15, or equally, were number 15 to come forward in the manner that you'll be considering later, again, that relationship is an acceptable relationship and would merit support. To look at the two schemes side by side, and as I say, the bottom image is the current proposals and ought to be considered on their own particular merits. It's not a comparative issue, but since you have previously taken a view, the refused proposals at the top of the page, and as I say, the reorientation of the car parking has afforded more opportunity to break up the amount of tarmac at the front. You'll see the point I made about the indentation setting in the rear elevation further away from number 11, and then similarly on the other side, on the other boundary, setting it in further away from number 15. And to come back just briefly to the architectural style that I alluded to earlier, the top image being the current proposals, I suggest a significant, a material difference in terms of its impact and character than the refused scheme at the bottom. The only things I draw your attention to particularly are that fundamental point about lifting the eaves height, lowering on the current proposal the eaves height, losing that additional footprint floor space in the top floor, significantly reducing the bulk and massing of the upper part of the building, created by that visual effect of having that upstand of the eaves above the first floor windows, whereas in the current proposal, more conventionally, the eaves sit at the top of the first floor windows. Chairman, there's one slight change to the recommendation. In the recommendation, condition 6, it references first and second floor windows requiring to be obscure glazed. In point of fact, I would recommend that that's now changed, or the recommendation now includes an amendment to that, which is just the second floor windows, since those windows reference are secondary windows to those rooms rather than primary window. So just the second floor bedroom windows to be obscure glazed, where they are secondary windows. Thank you, Chairman. All of the mitigation has already been secured, Chairman, in terms of Heathland and Poole Harbour. The recommendation before you is therefore to approve the application. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. We will now go to any objections or letters of support, and we have one in objection from a Jean Woodall. Mr. Tyler, would you care to read that out, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chairman. So I will just, for the committee's benefit, elucidate the fact that both the statements received, this one in support and the one in objection, the other way around, this one in objection and the one in support, have been submitted for both of the Dane Court applications before the committee today. So I'll read them out now, and unless any member indicates otherwise later on, I will leave it as just reading them out for this item. So the statement from Jean Woodall, who is the chair of the Viewpoint Residents Association and Neighbourhood Watch. Her statement is as follows. I urge you to refuse both these applications for 13 and 15 Dane Court Road on the following grounds. 2 successive applications and 1 resubmission which have not addressed BCP's original grounds for refusal. Quote, the scale of the building and plot coverage, including the layout of the car parking, would have a dominant appearance. A reduction from 9 to 8 flats does not address the problem, as outlined in the objections on 3 occasions from local residents. Any reference to precedents for approval of a similar development at 27 St Peter's Road should be disregarded. While the new applications for 13 and 15 Dane Court Road have changed the design of the proposed build so that it closely resembles that recently approved for 27 St Peter's Road, the committee should note that the manner in which that decision was arrived at under delegated authority is contested and now subject to a formal complaint on grounds of openness and objectivity, denying residents the opportunity to make representation to the Planning Committee. I respectfully urge you to refuse both these applications. That is the end of Jean Woodall's statement. And Chairman, now I will read out Mr. Darrell Howells of Pure Town Planning, who is the agent for this application. I'll read out his statement in support. Good afternoon, members. The planning application has received a recommendation to approve from the Head of Planning Services, as his senior planning officer has fully assessed the scheme and determined that it wholly complies with adopted planning policies in the development plan. As you know, the original application for 9 flats was refused for the reasons set out in paragraph 3 of your officer's report. To overcome that decision, the applicant has proactively worked with your SPO to resolve all areas of concern. The scheme has been significantly amended to reduce the scale of the building from a large 3-storey building that lacked characteristics of other housing in the street to a 2-storey building offering articulation and appropriate form similar to nearby houses. The style of the building now appears as a large detached residency, not a purpose-built block of flats. Where this design approach has been proposed before members have supported it as being imaginative or sympathetic to the street scene. Its exterior now has a high quality finish and will positively contribute to Dane Court Road. Amendments have been made to the car parking area, which previously offered a centrally positioned vehicular access and manoeuvring area with parking spaces either side. Such a layout offered little provision for landscaping. Now the scheme offers a vehicular access and parking arrangement that can be screened with landscaping, including areas for ornamental tree planting. Such changes will ensure the street will positively absorb this proposal. The proposed development has the full support of the Council's arboricultural officer, as the building, car parking area and pathway can be constructed without compromising any nearby tree. The proposed development has been designed to safeguard the amenities of neighbouring occupiers, so no harm shall occur. As you have been informed, this stretch of Dane Court Road is a designated sustainable transport corridor where flatted development is accepted in principle. As members have been informed, the previous scheme was now refused. As members have been informed, the previous scheme was refused and is now at appeal. The applicant purely wants to secure planning permission for his flatted development so he can commence and deliver the homes, jobs and investment that the permission would generate. So if members of this planning committee were minded to resolve to grant planning permission as per your officer's recommendation, then the applicant will agree to withdraw the current appeal immediately once the decision notice is received, in order to avoid any further unnecessary expenditure of the Council's funds or officers' time. This scheme meets the definition of sustainable development and therefore should be afforded the presumption in favour of supporting its approval, according to the National Planning Policy Framework and the local plan, as it will deliver environmental, social and economic benefits. Please support your officer's recommendation. That is the end of Mr. Darrell Howe's statement in support. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So over to members now. I have Councillor Stribley.
Thank you, Chairman. I am the ward councillor for this area, and I support much of what Jean Woodall said. She, in fact, chairs a very large and influential residents association, which in effect runs from Seaview right down through Parkstone to the Ashley Cross area, Harbourview Residents Association. There are some improvements to this application, but there are also some things which have been totally disregarded. Looking at the views we now have in front of us, the bottom right, west towards number 11, at the first floor we have a huge bank of windows which inevitably will be overlooking the property at number 11. And I am really concerned about that. The privacy of the gardens of adjacent neighbours would be, I think, very compromised by such a large bank of windows there, and I wonder in a moment if we can have some explanation of that. I agree most of the trees on the site are protected for the moment, and the rear of the site is mostly under tree cover in any event. The main objection was to the view in the street scene, and if we could look at the 2 parking schemes, the refused and what's now proposed, quite frankly there isn't that much difference. One, on the proposed scheme, the driveway is now to the right rather than the centre, but the amount of landscaping in the front is much narrower than proposed before, and the bins are taking up, I presume that's the bins store, I can't see it very well, are taking up, yes, the right-hand corner, adjacent to number 11, which I find very strange. And we've lost 2 parking spaces. Now, the whole frontage of Dane Court Road are relatively narrow drives and very, very mature front gardens. So although there are large properties on the sites, they are generally completely or almost completely obscured in the street scene. This will certainly open up the whole thing very much more, and I am very disappointed there is not better screening and landscaping to the proposed car park towards number 11, and I do believe the proposal could have been set back possibly very slightly to have accommodated better landscaping in the front. The landscaping adjacent to number 15 may not be at the frontage of the site, may not be quite so important in the street scene, because number 15 also is coming up, as we say, as the next application by the same developer. And I suspect they are separate to avoid any contribution towards affordable housing. So I have great concerns about overlooking from the first floor window, particularly towards number 11, about the total change of character to the frontages on Dane Court Road, which are presently large family houses accessed by relatively narrow driveways and all of them extremely well planted and mature. I did make one other point, and Dane Court Road also is not a designated traffic corridor. It is a 20-mile-an-hour limit. It is an approach road to a new academy school. Well, new, it's been there 2 or 3 years now. There are obstacles in the road which in themselves have caused serious accidents, but still have not been done, with very, very badly designed chicane put in. And in fact, there have been 3 or 4 accidents on that, with one car actually ending on its roof. The road is heavily parked, so in actual fact, as it runs off North Road, many cars have to stack up and are stacked back to North Road, and there is no passing place. So the cars going from west to east can't get through, because the cars coming from east to west are waiting for their access through the chicanes. The whole of the road in traffic terms is currently a nonsense. It is used as a rat run, and 2 years ago, when Poole Park Road was temporarily closed, the whole of the area blocked solid, so that Longfleet Road to Ringwood Road, which leads on to Dane Court Road, took a huge amount of extra traffic, which used Dane Court Road as it's cut through to Ashley Cross and Castle Hill, people needing to go east towards Bournemouth, and it blocked absolutely solid. And the council is currently permanently stopping traffic on Wycliffe Road through the bridge, which was in effect the cause of huge blockages and problems that we had last time, but now it's being used under different powers. So I know it's off-site, but in traffic terms, this is not an open transport corridor. It is a very, very restricted road, and we are looking at, in effect, the 20-mile-an-hour limit on the front. And as you can see, number 13, the frontage from the aerial photograph is covered with shrubs, trees, etc. it's going to be a car park. It will look so different in the street scene that I urge members, if they feel possible, that this is totally out of context with the area, out of character with the neighbourhood, and should therefore be refused on those grounds. I'm sure there are better plans that could come forward, Chairman.
Councillor Stribley, are you making a move to that effect, or would you like to hear the rest of the debate first?
I would be happy to propose refusal if I get a seconder in the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stribley.
I'd be prepared to, it's Councillor O'Neill, I'd be prepared to second that. I have similar concerns. Also adding to that the entrance to Bournemouth and Paul College at the rear, which is mainly traffic and stuff, but also used by footfall students who go in that way. And I also concur with the risks on Dane Court Road. It is a rat run, and I've experienced some of the dangers. So I would second Councillor Stribley.
Chairman, could I perhaps come in and address some of the concerns that's been expressed?
Yep, please do.
Thank you. Chairman, the suggestion that there is a number of windows that would give rise to, or a bank of windows, I think was the phrase used, and I believe the council was referring to this feature. The only part of that is a window is this, which is a bedroom window. I draw your attention to that feature being repeated around the building, and I'd say that you might colloquially refer to that as a half-timbered treatment, render and panel. So the only first floor window is to a bedroom there. That's the window I alluded to earlier. It's the sole window to a bedroom on that floor. These bedrooms up here are secondary windows and can be dealt with by obscured glazing. This window is the sole one to a bedroom. If I can take you onto the rear elevation, you'll see that there's a further rear-facing window to a bedroom, which is in the inset element there, and they are the only two windows on that element. Similarly, on the other face of the building, these are render and timber implied panels. Bear in mind, it is an outline application with all matters reserved, so this is purely indicative and illustrative, but they are not windows.
In that case, may I apologise and withdraw my comments regarding those windows? It was certainly not clear on the plan in front of me. So I take Mr Evans' point, and I withdraw my comments regarding the windows here.
Turning to, there was concern about the positioning of the bin store. On the previously approved scheme, you can see the bin store there. If you can visualise that frontage with the bin store, the area for access to service the bin store, the 6 metre minimum access, and then a bit of planting there. So from that point, because the visibility displays from that point on, this is very open, and all views into the site or into basically tarmac, or when it's parked cars, quite dominant. On the revised scheme, anyone moving down the road, the aspect through the entrance wouldn't be of parked cars, it would be into the significant belt of planting along the boundary of the site. Similarly, anyone moving east along the road, the screening to the screening to the car parking. So I would suggest that whereas before it was potentially quite dominant with all of this car parking or parked cars, views into the site now would be limited to the entrance, would not be across all of the parked cars, and would be views up to a couple of parked cars and the front elevation of the building. Quite a different aspect, quite a different context and character in the street, I would suggest. And that's why at the beginning of the presentation I said it is materially different in those respects. If we just look at the aerial photograph to look at the context of that, and I said there is a change in character along different stretches of Dane Court Road. If I can just draw your attention to the substantial areas of parking in front of the bigger buildings to the west of the application site. And whilst there's a lot of greenery shown in here, none of this is mature or protected trees. It is all shrubs. And I think you can get a better feel for the reality currently of that, with the a lot of that overgrown vegetation having been stripped out. And of course, none of it's protected. It could go anywhere. So going back to the bin store and their impact on the neighbours, which was another point concern about it being bin store being on the boundary in its relationship to number 11. I'd suggest that that separation distance of something of the order, I don't have a scale on this, but something of the order of 16 to 17 metres, I'd suggest, just judging it against the depth of 2 parking spaces in an aisle, I'd suggest there's a perfectly adequate and reasonable distance of separation between a bin stall and an adjacent dwelling. Sustainable transport corridor, a concern was expressed about the nature of the street and the Camp Street. The street is within a sustainable transport corridor, identified in the Poole local plan as within a sustainable transport corridor. That's not Dane Court Road, but it's within proximity of a principal traffic route, and that makes it an area that's identified in the local plan for siting new accommodation. The traffic, I'd suggest that I agree with the council that there are a number of reasons why people choose to use Dane Court Road. I've already alluded to Bournemouth and Poole College to the south. I can't remember for the life of me the name of the junior school on the other side of Constitution Hill Road, but another newly developed in the last...
Ocean Academy.
Thank you. Certainly in the last... Ocean Academy, yes. Certainly in the last 8 years, 10 years, a school there. So clearly there is traffic, and of course it is Constitution Hill Road is one of many oblique routes towards Poole Town Centre, avoiding some of the other routes. But I would suggest that given all of those issues, given all of the traffic that is already, and we've heard that traffic calming measures have been in place, which is a reflection of the traffic on the street, that the addition of in this case 8, even multiplied across the 2 sites, but in this case 8, so 7 new units within this context would add a trivial amount of additional traffic to what's already a well-used route, and that would have no, I'd suggest hardly any measurable impact on the safety and the movement of traffic in respect of Dane Court Road. There's a suggestion that there is an issue about parking on Dane Court Road. Clearly, since the application proposals comply with the adopted parking standards, I think it's reasonable to start from a position that it would consume its own smoke in terms of it provides the parking required to serve that development. I'd also draw the committee's attention to the fact that car parking, highway safety, parking on street, highway safety, vehicle movements in the vicinity was not a reason for which you previously refused the 9 units. I'd suggest to now introduce it in respect of a lesser scheme would be perceived as vexatious, and I'd very much caution the committee against introducing such a reason if you were minded to move to refuse the scheme. Thank you, Chairman. I think that covers the many points raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Councillor O'Neill, did you wish to come back and speak any further?
I think the statement just given is pertinent in a way to if you're just evaluating 13, but it's the sum of the parts in this instance. You've got 13 plus 15. It's close to the junction with Bournemouth and Poole College. I do believe there is significant risk, and certainly that needs to be considered. The only other thing I would add, that this development area is not typical of the street scene. The parking in the frontage and the apartments are very different to the surrounding houses, who, as Councillor Stribley has said, do have quite long driveways and well-presented gardens. So I think it's dramatic change. Thank you.
Thank you. But I think I need to remind members that we are at this moment in time purely considering number 13. We are not considering any aspects of number 15 at this time. Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking at the section on neighbours, amenity and privacy, and just the question is, so we're looking at an outline proposal before us. Obviously, what's the section 29 to 33 covers what's before us and how it can be mitigated by conditions with obscured screens and glazing. I just wanted the officer just to confirm how in effect it would work if what before us slightly gets amended from the outline, and how that would be resolved by the officers. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Evans?
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, the application isn't outlined with all matters reserved, which means that everything that you're looking at is indicative, is illustrative. But it is a legitimate way for the developer to bring forward alternative proposals without having to go into the full detail and basically deal with all the matters that will then follow on from any outline approval. It seeks to establish the principle, and it would normally be the case that where an applicant has overcome concerns or dealt with the constraints of the site as part of their outline proposal, that they would follow through on that outline scheme into their detailed proposals because they've already established that it's acceptable to officers. You know, it's not very often that we see a developer come back with a completely different scheme on reserved matters than we've seen at the outline. It does happen. We could get a completely different scheme coming back to us if you were minded to approve this outline, if the site changed hands and a different developer with a different concept for the site came forward. But that would be a matter for a subsequent level of consideration. So essentially what you're considering here is the principle of this building, of a building for 8 flats on this site. And what the applicants are looking to do is demonstrate that you can get a building with 8 flats on this site in a satisfactory manner. You can accommodate the car parking, you can provide substantial amenity space, you can do it in a way that's acceptable in terms of the trees. But as I say, the elevations that we're looking at are largely illustrative, but would be the takeoff point for subsequent discussions or subsequent submissions if the outline was approved and reserved matters came forward. I hope that answers the question, Chair.
Well, just really all I was focusing on, the issues about overlooking and overshadowing seem to be resolved by the way the windows are positioned, and they could be conditioned to be obscured. So it's really just to say what we're looking at now, there is no issue with overlooking in prime areas or overshadowing, which will be more than what they're receiving at the moment. And if they did change it, as you just said, which is hopefully unlikely, again, you as an officer would ensure that they haven't changed that amenity impact. Thank you.
I think that's exactly correct, Councillor Hilliard. It does, to all intents and purposes, give members of this board a second bite of the cherry, as if they come back in with a completely different layout and style of building, we then have the opportunities to say, well, actually, no. So I think Mr. Evans is absolutely right on his assessment of it at this moment in time, as are you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Johnson.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, no, I have to say I couldn't disagree more with the comments that have been made so far by Councillor Stribley and O'Neill. I really quite like this development. I think it's far more sympathetic to the local area. I think the design has been improved greatly. I can't understand any arguments about dominance or overlooking or anything like that, because it is pretty much the same size as its next door neighbour to the west at number 11. There are buildings even larger down the road to the west. I cannot see any dominance there. As the bird's eye view shows that Mr. Evans showed, there are large tarmacked areas on most of the properties to the west, as we can see there, with varying levels of screening. I think the parking scheme has been greatly improved to lessen its impact on the surrounding area, and personally I cannot see any planning reason to refuse this. The only thing that I could think possibly would be a problem would be the impact on the local traffic, but at the end of the day it is only 8 spaces, it's only 8 cars. I think it would be minimal, as Mr. Evans has said, so I, for one, won't be supporting the move to reject, and if it is, if the committee are minded to vote with me against that move, I would be happy to propose a move to grant the application as set out, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Johnson. Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. I agree entirely with Councillor Johnson, and I would be prepared to second a move for grant should the move to not grant be rejected. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Bartlett. For myself, I did visit the site yesterday. I was absolutely amazed at how much parking there was in that street when I got there. I appreciate the university is not operating at this moment in time. With regards to the street scene, I actually think these will be a vast improvement It may be a chance for number 11 to change that great monstrosity of a gate that they have at the front of their premises. I thought it was absolutely ghastly, and I'm surprised they've actually been allowed to have it there. When you look further down at number 17, you cannot even see that property for the overgrowth of trees, etc. in the front. And I think the improvements that will be made to number 13, which we are dealing with at this moment, would vastly outweigh anything else at this moment in time. So I also will not support the move to refuse this. But as by the rights, we have a move to refuse this application by Councillor Stribley and seconded by Councillor O'Neill. I will ask in turn each councillor to indicate how they wish to vote. So starting with Councillor McCormack.
Against.
Councillor Bull.
Against.
Councillor Bartlett.
Against.
Councillor Davies.
You pause the refusal. Okay. Continue.
Councillor Davies.
For.
Councillor Hall. Councillor Hall.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
Against.
Councillor Hilliard.
Against.
Councillor Lepodovin.
Against.
Councillor Lawton.
Against.
Councillor O'Neill.
For.
Councillor Stribley.
For.
Councillor Trent.
Against.
And Councillor Kelsey, myself, against. Joe, could we have the totals, please?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Thank you. So the total number of votes for the motion is 4. The total number of votes against the motion is 9, and there were no abstentions. So that motion has been defeated. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So with that noted, Councillor Johnson, you indicated that you would wish to move a motion to grant.
Yes, that's correct, Chair, and I'm still happy to do so.
And Councillor Bartlett, are you still happy to second that move?
I am, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. In that case, I will once again go through the numbers and the names if you could indicate how you wish to vote. Thank you. Councillor McCormack.
For.
This is for the application, yes, to agree the application. So, Councillor McCormack?
For.
Councillor Bull?
For.
Councillor Bartlett?
For.
Councillor Davies?
For.
Councillor Hall?
Against.
Councillor Hilliard?
For.
Councillor Johnson?
For.
Councillor Podovin?
For.
Councillor Lawton?
For.
Councillor O'Neill?
Against.
Councillor Stribley?
Abstain.
And Councillor Trent?
For.
And myself, Councillor Kelsey, 4. Joe, could we have the results of that, please?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. So the total number of votes for the motion is 10. The total number of votes against the motion is 2, and there was 1 abstention. So that motion has passed. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tyler. Thank you to members and Mr. Evans. Moving on to the second application, or the next one, sorry, which is 8F, and that is for 15 Dane Court Road. And again, I would ask Mr. Evans to present the case, please.
That may take me slightly longer to set it up, Chairman, if you would just
No problem,
excuse
Mr. Evans. Take your time. No problem. Members, while Mr. Evans is setting up, could I just remind you that the 2 deputations, 1 for and 1 against, are the same as that were heard for the previous item. Are members happy that Mr. Tyler does not need to read those out again?
Agreed.
Happy.
Agreed.
Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Evans.
Chairman, thank you. We are back in the same area clearly, and because of what's gone before and because we're taking certain matters as read, I will not repeat the preamble other than to draw your attention to the fact that, of course, number 15 is now the adjacent site to number 13. Just to give you the context of that, number 15, front elevation, top left, rear elevation, top right. The garden is slightly split level, as you can perhaps get from the rear elevation in this central image. There is a step up towards the rear, but again, no preserved trees, excuse me, no substantial landscaping impacted by the proposals as such. Number 17, the next property, now adjoining property to the right, to the east, does have some accommodation within the roof space. It is a bungalow, primarily built with accommodation within the roof space. To give the context, the existing house in purple and its substantial garage, similarly to the application that you've just considered, it differs from the previous scheme in the insetting of the rear element of the building away from the boundaries. That facilitates windows to bedrooms in these positions having an aspect towards the rear, and it does give greater separation to the adjacent sites. Similarly to the number 13, the car parking has been turned through 90 degrees relative to the previous scheme, and because of the nature of the site, there is an even greater opportunity to introduce landscaping along the frontage to break up views excuse me, and aspects into the site across the car parking and over the car parking. Excuse me. Again, the purple outline indicates the existing house on the site. I draw your attention to the largely coincident relationship between the side elevation as proposed and the existing house. So the side elevation to number 17, the bungalow, the side elevation to number 13, for the avoidance of doubt, window, panels to reflect the panels, the half timbering in inverted commas around the building, and the rear elevation. Similar floor plans to previous to the scheme at number 13. Configuration of 3 flats, 3 flats, 2 flats. And I think we can now, with perhaps a greater degree of certainty, consider the wider street scene in respect of the application. Clearly, as before, you are considering this application, number 15, on its individual merits, but clearly the previous decision is a material consideration. And what I'd like to draw your attention to here is within the context of its relationship, in the event that the scheme that you've now approved at number 13 does not come forward, the relationship between the proposal of 15 and the existing situation, number 13, is an acceptable relationship, and clearly a relationship that we're content with in terms of its relationship to number 17, something of the order of 12 metres separation between the side elevation where you saw the windows inside of the in the roof space of the bungalow and windows in the side elevation of the proposed building. And as I say, I think we can move with perhaps a greater degree of confidence to consider street scheme as an emerging context, an emerging character. And what I particularly draw attention to is the attempt that's been made in designing the scheme to avoid it being replication of a similar unit. It's clearly of the same drawing board, it's clearly out the same stable, but there are very significant subtle differences between the two designs. I draw your attention to the treatment of the roof, for instance, which does set the two parts, or sorry, set the two buildings slightly apart, very similar, but then you'd expect to find that in many streets, similar buildings, similar architecture, but not identical. And I suggest that the changes that have been made overcome the previous concerns that the committee had. And setting that aside, I'd suggest that the scheme is in its own right and considered on its individual particular merits is an acceptable scheme. And the recommendation, Chairman, is that planning permission be granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. So I will go straight to members. Do I have anyone wishing to speak at this time? Councillor Bartlett.
Yes, Chairman, in view of the preceding debate, I'm going to go straight ahead and move to grant this application.
Thank you, Councillor Bartlett. Do I have a seconder for Councillor Bartlett's move, please?
I'll second that, Dave.
Thank you, Councillor Lawton. And is anyone wishing to speak in any alternative way or about this application? If not, we will move to the vote, as we have rehearsed pretty much everything on the previous application. I have no indicators to speak, so I will move straight to the vote. Again, I will call names in order. If you can indicate on how you wish to vote on this application, please. Councillor McCormack.
For.
Councillor Bull.
For.
Councillor Bartlett.
For.
Councillor Davies.
For.
Councillor Hall.
For.
Councillor Hilliard.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Councillor Lepodovin.
For.
Councillor Lawton.
For.
Councillor O'Neill.
Against.
Councillor Stribley.
Against, but Chairman, I actually lost connection. I did want to briefly speak, but I now will leave it for another time.
Thank you, Councillor Stribley. Councillor Trent.
For.
And myself, Councillor Kelsey, also for. Mr. Tyler, could we have the numbers on that, please?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Thank you. So the total number of votes for the motion is 11, and the total number of votes against the motion is 12. There were no abstentions, so that motion has been carried. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So that application is granted as per the applicant's application, and we will now move on to the next agenda item, which is...
Excuse me, Chairman, how can we have 11 and 12 votes?
Sorry?
Mr. Tyler said we had 11 votes one way and 12 the other. How's that possible?
I think he's made a mistake there. Mr. Tyler, could you just clarify, please?
Certainly. I do apologise if I did make that error. To confirm, the number of votes for the motion was 11. The number of votes against the motion was 2, and there were no abstentions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So moving on then, ladies and members, we will move on now to item 8G on the agenda, which is 40A Portfield Close in Christchurch. And Mr. Hodges, would you be prepared to present this case, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Chairman, I'm presuming everyone can see the presentation. Members will recall dealing with this application previously at an earlier meeting of the BCP Planning Committee. At that committee, the application was refused. You'll see from the report that subsequent appeal was dismissed, but the sole reason for dismissal was in relation to the adequacy of a unilateral undertaking to agree suitable mitigation for heathland impacts. And the reasons advanced by the council on the character of the area, parking issues and the impact on neighbours' living conditions were not supported. Just to take you through, the left-hand side shows the currently proposed scheme, and the right-hand side is the dismissed scheme. So you can see that they are identical, with the exception of an addition of a hedge to the front and rear boundary on the current proposal. And in relation to the proposed and the dismissed scheme, you'll see the sole difference is that there is a single rear-facing bedroom window instead of 2 bedroom windows to the rear-facing elevation. For those reasons, Chairman, as set out in the report, the application is acceptable.
Thank you, Mr. Hodges. Mr. Tyler, could you read out the letters of objection, please?
Yes, certainly, Chairman. Thank you. So for this item, we have received 2 statements in objection and 1 in support. I will now proceed to read out the first statement in objection, which is from Mr. Peter Southery, who is a local resident. His statement is as follows. As detailed in previous objections, this development is not wanted by the majority of local residents and would provide a cramped form of infill development. Where no objections have been received from neighbouring properties, it is possible that this is because they may also wish to develop their gardens in the future. If the Planning Committee were to make the decision to grant permission, I would request that consideration is given to 1. Placing restrictions on the construction work. Restricting the hours in which deliveries are made to outside of school hours due to the close proximity of Christchurch infants and juniors, with significant parking and pedestrian safety issues already existing. And to prevent the original host property number 20 Grove Road East or adjacent properties on Grove Road East from being used as a means of delivery, storage or access to the construction works, given that the new application is based on the plot having been severed. 2. Placing restriction on the development, preventing any future pedestrian right of access from the new dwelling to Grove Road East. That is the end of Mr. Peter Southery's objection. The second letter of objection has come from a Ms. Carol Cronshaw, who is also a local resident, and her statement is as follows. Chair and committee members, it is with regret that we, the objectors, find ourselves discussing this planning application. The officer's report has not been published on the planning application website. This is unacceptable and has minor alterations to an original application overwhelmingly refused at committee in June 2019 for the following reasons. 1. Overbearing on its neighbours. 2. Failure to be compatible with or improve its surroundings. 3. Incongruous feature in the street scene in Portfield Close. The amendments do not change this fact. For those of you who have visited the site, you will be aware that Portfield Close has a very cramped feel about it, with 41 houses in 120 metres length of road. The Close has only 13 on-road parking spaces. This application seeks to build on the only open area within the Close. The original application went to appeal and the inspector reported, paragraph 13, that the Close had an unfinished appearance. This is a personal opinion which we strongly disagree with. In paragraph 18, he mentions the brick wall abutting the parking spaces of 18 Grove Road East and 41 Portfield Close being less blank because of 2 very small bathroom windows. The extent of this wall is open to debate. The applicant states the length to be 9.1 metres when the scale plan indicates it to be 10.5 metres long. This is a substantial increase. At the end of the Close is Christchurch Infant School, who had an informal agreement with Peaks that parents might park there to drop off and collect children. With the closure of Peaks, this is no longer the case. When children return in September, the increase in traffic will be significant. At times, it is impossible for residents of Portfield Close to exit out onto Portfield Road. Indeed, it is impossible to know how the developer will be able to have deliveries and workmen parking. Committee, in January you granted permission on the Reed Steel site for 167 new dwellings, and in February you granted permission for 169 dwellings on the former police station site, Astor Development. With all these schemes in mind, there is the potential for a further 500 plus vehicles within a square kilometre of Christchurch Primary School. At present, there is no comment from the Council of any improvements to the infrastructure. Any new development proposal, whether it be the 2 previously mentioned or this one dwelling, is likely to generate additional traffic. This will materially affect road safety and will put further strain on the existing transport infrastructure to accommodate the additional traffic. In conclusion, we would ask the committee members to stick by their original decision from June 2019 and categorically refuse this application. And that is the end of Ms. Carol Cronshaw's statement of objection. Chair, I just wanted to check, I'm unaware if there was any background noise during my reading of that, in case members heard it all fully and clearly.
No, I could hear nothing.
Okay, thank you very much. Chair, then I will move on to the statement in support of the application, which was has been received from Mr. John Hammond of Chapman and Lilly Planning. His statement is as follows. Thank you for providing us with an opportunity to make representations upon the planning application currently before the Planning Committee. Whilst the site has raised a degree of local objection, on the face of it, the issues before the committee should be relatively straightforward. This application is effectively a resubmission of a scheme previously considered and refused by the Council last year, and which was the subject of a subsequent appeal. The issues raised with you today are the same concerns raised in relation to the appeal scheme, and therefore dealt with in some detail by the inspector. The comprehensive case officer report into the current scheme deals with each of the issues and provides you with not only her objective assessment of the scheme's impacts, but also cross-refers to the inspector's conclusions. As such, you can take some significant reassurance that the recommendation is both sound and has benefited from a professional peer review. The reason the previous scheme was dismissed by the inspector related only to the lack of a suitable Section 106 agreement to deal with heathland mitigation. A commitment has been provided to the Council's solicitor that the applicant will complete your template Section 106 to resolve this outstanding issue. The only changes in circumstance between the inspector's decision in December and today is that, notwithstanding his finding of no harm by reason of overlooking, the applicant has chosen to offer a reduction in first floor rear window openings from the scheme the Council previously refused. This change has replaced 2x2 light windows to the rear bedroom with a single centrally located window. This takes the window further away from the neighbouring boundaries compared to the previous scheme and reduces the area of glazing by some 25%. This is a positive response to an issue which was not found to be materially harmful. The other change noted by the case officer relates to the current housing supply position compared to that in existence last year. Given the level of scrutiny applied to this application through the appeal process, you can be confident that the officer's recommendation is both sound and reasonable in all respect, and we look forward to receiving a positive decision. Thank you for taking the time to hear the applicant's final comments. And that is the end of Mr. John Hammond's statement in support. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So over to members on this one now. Do I have anyone requesting to speak at this time? Very quiet. Councillor Hilliard.
Thank you, Chair. So just wanting to look again, go to the appeal summary. So if the officer could confirm that, obviously, as we've heard, we as a committee said there would be a detrimental impact on neighbours' living conditions, there'd be an impact on the character of the area, and there'd be an impact of lack of parking in the close, and particular to 12 Grow Road. The inspector dismissed all of those, and they merely focused on the impact on the protected heathland. Is that correct?
Mr. Hodges?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Yes, that's set out in para 9 of the report, where there's a summary of the reasons for the previous refusal and the conclusions of the inspector. And you'll see that through the rest of the report that we've picked out particular issues where they've looked at those concerns that the expressed in the previous refusal about living conditions and the character of the area and the impact on parking provision. And in those instances, the inspector did not find those harmful, but simply dismissed the scheme on the basis of the adequacy of the unilateral undertaking for heathland mitigation.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you. Councillor Lepardovin?
Thank you. I still feel much the same as I did last time on this one, but given the verdict from the inspector, and assuming that all inspectors will hang together, and if it went to an appeal a second time it wouldn't get a different verdict, I don't think we've got any option but to accept this. So I'll move we accept.
Are you making a move to that, Councillor
I'm
Pollard?
making a move. Yes,
You are.
I move we accept.
Yep. Okay. Thank you very much. And do we have a seconder for that move, please? I am happy to second that. I did go and visit the site yesterday. A lot of talk about the parking issues. The fact of the matter is that a lot of the residents down there are actually converted their front drives for parking, but without the implication of dropped curbs. So a lot of their parking problems is of their own making, and I don't wish to sound nasty when I say that. I think the inspector's report was quite detailed, and I do agree with him on what he is saying. So I will be supporting this, and I will second that move. Do I have anyone else wishing to speak before we go to a vote on that? No? Okay, I will call names again as normal, and if you could indicate how you wish to vote as we call each name, please. Thank you. So, Councillor McCormack.
Against.
Councillor Bull.
For.
Councillor Bartlett.
For.
Councillor Davies.
For.
Councillor Peter Hall.
Against.
Councillor Hilliard.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Councillor Podovin.
For.
Councillor Lawton.
For.
Councillor O'Neill.
Against.
Councillor Stribley.
For.
Councillor Trent.
For.
Myself, Councillor Kelsey, also for. Mr. Tyler, could we have the results, please?
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chairman. So the total number of votes for the motion was 10. The total number of votes against the motion was 3. And there were no abstentions, so that motion has carried. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So that application is granted as per the officer's recommendation. Thank you to all those who have written in and taken part in that. And we will move on now to item 8H on the agenda, which is number 20 Upton Way in Broadstone. And again, the presenting officer for this one will be Mr. Doug Evans. When you're ready, Mr. Evans.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, the proposal 20 Upton Way is for 6 flats, all 6 of them 2-bed flats, and it will be a site that members may be familiar with as we progress. Just to give you a general indication, very close to the centre of Broadstone in the northwest of the borough. On the aerial photograph, I draw your attention to the area of land to the west of the red-lined application site, and as also identified on the Ordnance Survey Plan. Members may recall the Planning Permission was given a little while back for a block of 6 flats on that. Number 20 having previously had a double width plot, the next house in the street being number 24, and planning permission has already been given for this part of their former curtilage for the erection of 6 flats. As I said, the application site is close to the centre of Broadstone, and the Broadstone neighbourhood plan identifies a core area, an inner zone, within which there is a wish to deliver more 2-bedroom and less accommodation, 1 and 2 bed accommodation. The proposals therefore are within that inner zone, around the Broadway in the centre of Broadstone, and therefore the principle of 2-bedroom flats in this location is wholly in accordance with the provisions of the neighbourhood plan. The site as it stands at the moment, top left corner, you can see where there is currently a hoarding around the previously approved western part of the property, the side garden. You can see the property beyond there, number 24. The application site is now the remaining curtilage plus part of the adjoining site of the original house number 22. You can see its relationship to number 18, which is the next house to the west. Again, looking to the excuse me, rear garden, draw your attention then particularly to the change in levels. You can see that above damp course there's already an upstand on the existing house, and you can see how levels fall from the front of the site on the road to the rear of the site into and continue to fall. Again, the existing house proposed to be demolished and the block of flats erected in its place. So taking that into 2 dimensions, the existing house is car parking at the front, its long rear garden, and the extant permission not yet implemented, so far as I'm aware, on the adjoining land, which was a block of flats, parking to the rear, cycle store at the rear, some car parking, visitor parking at the front. The proposal would, as perhaps was apparent when we looked at that aerial photograph, oops. You'll appreciate that the width of the site that you're dealing with today is includes land that was previously part of the other application. It's not that this is 2/3 of the width and the other site was 1/3. There is a significant overlap down the middle, and the reason for that overlap is, as you might expect, both schemes are seeking to reduce the amount of area given over to hard surfacing and access, and to have a shared access. So the access that would previously have served just the car parking to serve the already approved block will now be used to also serve the car parking at the rear and the car parking at the front of the building before you today. Similar configuration at the rear, car parking to the rear with access off that central access road. Slightly different configuration at the rear in terms of the bicycle. So principally, because as you will have seen in the aerial photograph, the extended rear gardens of the two streets between Clarendon Road and Upton Way do form something of a green corridor with mature vegetation, albeit stripped out and not protected within the application site, but clearly well established rear gardens, and they do form, therefore, whilst not a special habitat, they nevertheless create a green corridor. And the thinking in terms of the introduction of the cycle store in a slightly different way was to minimise the impact in terms of the disconnect across this green corridor and make sure there was continuity across the corridor. I suggest that we have achieved that. One of the considerations equally on the previous scheme was about how prominent and visible this car parking at the rear would be, and on that occasion we went to great lengths to demonstrate how it was only while we were virtually immediately adjacent the access that you had views back into the site, and there were distant views towards the trees and houses beyond, because clearly any oblique views were merely into the side elevation of either the original house or into the side elevation of the proposed flats. So the proposed car parking at the rear would not be visually intrusive within the street scene. As I indicated on the photographs, a significant change in level from the front of the site down towards the rear garden, such that the configuration is 2 stories with rooms in the roof to the front, to the street, and by the time it gets to the rear, there's the opportunity for it to introduce, with very little digging in, shall we say, a further story. So from the rear, 3 stories and the roof. The architecture very much reflecting the character of the area as it is, very much reflecting the character of the previously approved scheme next door. In terms of that configuration of accommodation within the building, that lower ground floor, single flat with an aspect towards the rear garden. On the upper floor, or on the ground floor to street level, 2 flats with access from the front, so both having an aspect to the rear and to the front. Similarly on the first floor, and again the 1 flat on the top floor. So a configuration of 1 flat, 2 flats, 2 flats, and 1 to make up the 6 flats. We can have some degree of confidence about the emerging street scene because of the previously approved building on the side of the curtilage of the house. So the house now under consideration to be demolished. This one, the replacement block of flats, again not mimicking the design or character of the already approved scheme, fitting very much into that character and range of design and architectural features that you might expect to find in some of the suburban streets radiating out from the centre of Broadstone. I'd suggest a wholly appropriate response to the site. Chairman, the recommendation is that planning permission be granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Tyler, I wonder if you could read out any statements that are relevant, please.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Chairman. So for this item, we have received a statement in objection and a statement in support. So starting with the statement in objection, for context, this has been received from a Mr. Ralph Smart and Mr. George Lawrence. Their combined statement was submitted on behalf of 41 local households, and their statement is as follows. We strongly object to the planning application for the proposed demolition of number 20 Upton Way and the erection of 6 flats, and urge members to regard this statement as a properly constructed planning case. It reflects the jointly prepared objections we submitted in response to the application and has the full support of those listed at the end of the statement. Whilst residents are naturally concerned about the gradualist approach to the way in which a succession of planning applications has been submitted, not to mention the applicant's claims about biodiversity enhancements on a site which they have stripped, we have confined ourselves to the principal issue of character. The case officer's report naturally makes much of the proposal's conformity with aspects of the National Planning Policy Framework, the Poole Local Plan and the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan. We do not dispute the proposal's compliance with policies within those documents which seek to support the effective use of small sites in sustainable locations as a contribution to the provision of necessary housing. This last phrase was used by the inspector in his decision letter of August 2019 after the most recent appeal regarding this site. Although he considered a different, and in our view less intrusive, scheme and himself acknowledged such compliance, he very clearly indicated that it was also necessary to then consider the desire of the National Planning Policy Framework and the local plan to achieve well-designed places that are sympathetic to the surrounding environment, and whether or not the proposals resulted in harm to the character and appearance of the area, being in conflict with policies PP27 and PP28 of the local plan. He found that the main issue is therefore the effect of the development on the character and appearance of the area. This is also true of the application now before the committee, and in the end it is what the committee must ask itself. Does the proposal to add a further 6 flats to the six approved last July, with a total of 18 parking spaces front and rear, together with the required turning area, necessary bike and bin stores, and a wall-to-wall central driveway, really preserve or enhance the prevailing character of a street in which every single dwelling is, to use the inspector's words again, a detached 2-storey house on a large plot? It is perhaps worth reminding the committee of the present case officer's own statement in respect of the second appeal on this site. She said a significant proportion of the appeal site would be hard surfaced to provide vehicular access and car parking spaces for the dwellings at the front of the site, fronting Upton Way. This would result in a stark environment across the 2 frontage buildings and would be completely at odds with the predominance of landscape on the site and the characteristic of the street. Adding that, the site cannot be developed to the extent proposed whilst providing appropriate levels of parking in a manner reflective of the prevailing residential character. The present proposal is so much worse with the central driveway, wall to wall between the 2 blocks, allowing for views from the streets which, again to quote a previous inspector, make it apparent that uncharacteristic development had taken place. The most recent dismissed appeal, referred to above, would have taken a hard surfaced area of just under half of the site, whereas the current proposal, taken together with other developments now approved for the site, would create a hard surfaced area amounting to over 2/3 of the original plot, known as number 20 Upton Way. The case officer had also suggested that the addition of additional driveway car parking was permitted development, but that only relates to single dwelling houses, unlikely to have more than 2 or 3 cars, with spaces virtually never located on rear private garden space. What the committee has before it is the need for 9 on-site spaces per block, 3 in front and 6 at the rear, and the need for further family and visitor parking on the road. Once verdant garden areas will be a sea of parked cars and tarmac. It is therefore astonishing that the case officer can conclude, in paragraph 42 of her report, that the social and economic benefits of 5 additional residential units can be achieved without any identified environmental harm. She set out the harm admirably in her own appeal statement quoted above. The harm is no different in respect of this scheme. The character of this part of Upton Way will not be preserved or enhanced, it will be destroyed, and any other plot that becomes available will be fair game. Whilst that does use precedent in aid of our position, that is just what the applicants are arguing in seeking to have this application approved. We therefore respectfully ask that the application be refused for the following reason. Taken together with proposals already approved on the adjoining part of the site of 20 Upton Way, the cumulative impact of the development now proposed on the remainder of the site means that it fails to comply with policies PP27 and PP28 of the Poole Local Plan, which require proposals to reflect or enhance existing patterns of development, provide for parking servicing in keeping with existing patterns of development, have, in the case of flats, a hard surface plot coverage that respects that which prevails in the street, accommodate parking, turning in a way that does dominate, and in the case of plot severance, have sufficient land to accommodate development in a manner that preserves or enhances the area's residential character. Thank you, Chairman. That is the end of the combined statement from Mr. Richard Wilson and Mr. David Ralph, and on behalf of 41 local residents. I will now proceed to read the statement in support of the item, which is from Mr. Darrell Howells of Pure Town Planning, who is the agent. His statement is as follows. This planning application has received a recommendation to approve from the Head of Planning Services, as his planning officer has fully assessed the scheme and determined that it wholly complies with adopted planning policies that govern the impact to the character, appearance, housing delivery, highway safety, or biodiversity. Flatted development is permitted here as policy PP02 identifies this stretch of Upton Way as a designated sustainable transport corridor. Policy BP5 of the adopted Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan locates the site in the inner zone for housing and specifically seeks provision of new 1 or 2 bedroom dwellings. The definition of a dwelling, according to the plan's preamble in paragraph 3.4.6, includes flatted development or apartments. The design of the proposed block has been articulated so that it appears as a large detached dwelling which is characteristic of Upton Way. Previously, when the other flatted application was considered, this committee considered it an imaginative approach to accommodate flats without adversely affecting the street scene. According to the minutes, all members unanimously voted to support that proposal. The proposed development has been designed to safeguard the amenities of neighbouring occupiers and those occupiers to be accommodated in either the proposed or approved blocks. The scheme will utilise the approved vehicular access of Upton Way and the manoeuvring area towards the rear of the site. Doing so represents an efficient use of land, reducing the number of vehicular access crossover points and improves highway safety. The scheme has the full support of your highway officer. The scheme has been modified to improve wildlife corridors and offers separate bat and swift boxes affixed beneath the eaves of the proposed building. At the rear of the site, there will be a designated wildflower area with additional tree planting that will be visible from Upton Way, between the approved and proposed block of flats. As such, the scheme before you will improve the biodiversity that currently exists and accords with the local plan and Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan related policies. The proposed development will provide 6 homes that are obtainable in terms of occupiers' financial means compared to the loss of a single family house. I would opine that there remain sufficient numbers of family-sized houses in the whole of Broadstone to alleviate Councillor Brooks' concern that this scheme will undermine the housing stock. This scheme meets the definition of sustainable development as set out in the National Planning Policy Framework and Policy PP01 of the adopted local plan, so I would ask you to support the officer's recommendation to approve, please. That is the end of Darrell Howell's statement of support, Chairman, and I will pass back to you to invite Councillor Brooke, the Ward Councillor, to speak. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. Councillor Brooke, would you like to speak now, please?
If I may, Chairman, can you hear me?
I can indeed, thank you.
And just before I start, I would just like to point out that my statement has been made independently of those put forward by David Ralph and Richard Wilson. You will see, though, that there are similarities, and that's because the issues are so significant. I will now start, if I may.
Thank you.
Thank you. Given the lack of balance in the case officer's report, it is necessary to focus on the level of harm resulting from the cumulative effects of the 2 blocks of 6 flats on this site, should this application be approved. The most relevant policies are Pool Local Plan PP 27 and PP 28, the Neighbourhood Plan BP3, BP4 and BP5, and paragraphs 122, 124, 127 and 130 of the NPPF. Although this application meets the minimum density requirement set out in the Pool Local Plan, the cumulative effect creates a density that is inappropriate for a suburban area. At virtually 70 dwellings per hectare, it represents almost a 7-fold increase over the existing density of just under 11 dwellings per hectare. It is totally out of character, therefore, with that of the immediate area, and so causes significant harm. The overall poor design and layout results in an excessive amount of hard surfacing, both in the front and to the rear of the plot. The Council, in its response to the earlier appeals, stated a significant proportion of the appeal site would be hard surfaced to provide vehicular access and car parking spaces for dwellings at the front of the site, fronting Upton Way. This would result in a stark environment across the 2 frontage buildings and will be completely at odds with the predominance of landscape on the site and characteristics of the street. And the site cannot be developed to the extent proposed whilst providing appropriate levels of parking in a manner reflective of the prevailing residential character. In dismissing the 2 appeals, both inspectors agreed. They said the overall effect of the development would therefore contrast strongly with the grain of the development in the area and harmfully interrupt the rhythm and harmony of the street scene. That street scene is one of a pleasant suburban and sylvan character, and while the long back gardens of the houses are not readily visible from the street, the feeling of spaciousness to the rear is evident due to the backdrop of trees and the general absence of buildings in the views between the houses. With an additional 6 car parking spaces to the rear of the dwellings, giving a combined total of 12, the overall impacts upon neighbouring properties will be significant. The noise levels and exhaust fumes will have a strong negative impact on residents' health and well-being, as well as on the enjoyment of their own amenity space. Furthermore, none of the hard surfacing being used for access and car parking counts towards the amenity space available to residents. This proposal not only significantly reduces the amount of garden space available, but it creates an unsatisfactory outlook for the residents, diminishing its value and likely usage. This represents poor quality design, which is not only unacceptable according to the National Planning Policy Framework, but it is also contrary to policy BP4 of the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan and PP 27 and PP 28 of the Pool Local Plan. A further negative impact of this proposal is the resultant loss of biodiversity and a damaging impact upon a part of what is a significant rear garden green corridor. There has been a wanton destruction of all trees, including those that had considerable amenity value within the street scene. The amount of land available for replanting and landscaping is insufficient to restore the former quantity and variety of vegetation. As a result, it is unlikely that this plot will ever reflect the current character of the street scene. The provision of a swift box and 1 or 2 other accoutrements represents a cynical approach to the whole issue of biodiversity and environmental enhancement. It is contrary to BP3. Adding another 6 flats on this site does nothing to address the housing balance. The loss of the previously approved semi-detached properties and the proposed demolition of the existing house means the loss of 3 much-needed family homes, which are already in short supply, and thus exacerbating a growing imbalance due to continued provision of flats. The NPPF, Pool Local Plan and Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan all aim to achieve well-designed places that are sympathetic to the surrounding built environment. On balance, the development as proposed, with its excessive extent of hard surfacing, including the access drive between the two buildings, would result in significant harm to the character and appearance of the immediate neighbourhood. The extent of this harm, as determined by government inspectors, is such that its cumulative effects outweigh the inner zone policy BP5 of the Broadstone Neighbourhood Plan, and consequently results in conflicts with policies PP27 and PP28 of the Poole Local Plan, which require proposals that reflect or enhance existing patterns of development, provide for parking and servicing in keeping with existing patterns of development, have, in the case of flats, a hard surface plot coverage that respects that which prevails in the street, and do not accommodate parking and turning in a way that dominates the site. And in the case of plot severance, have sufficient land to accommodate the development in a manner that preserves or enhances the area's residential character. This application does none of these. Paragraph 130 of the NPPF states, permission should be refused for development of poor design that fails to take the opportunities available for improving the character and quality of an area and the way it functions. Thank you, Chair and Committee, for listening.
Thank you, Councillor Brooke. I will now go to members of the board for comment. Before I do that, Mr. Evans, is there anything you would like to come back on as to what you've heard in deputations?
John, I think I'd just like to touch on the views opined by the previous inspectors on the application side. Unfortunately, I don't have an image of the applications that they were addressing, but they are set out in paragraphs 8 through 13 of your report, and particularly, sorry, can I just stop Councillor Hall? Set out particularly in paragraphs 8, 9 and 11 of your report. You may not have access to it if you've only got a single screen. Let me perhaps explain to you what the effect of those applications was. The application that was approved previously, before the 6 flats were approved on this part of the site, was for a pair of semi-detached houses. We subsequently had to deal with an application that, in addition to the, I'm afraid it's frozen, Chairman, because a councillor is clicking on the take control of the presentation. So if I could perhaps ask councillors not to click on the element that says request control. I've now lost control of the presentation for the moment. Okay. It's back. So the application was for a pair of semi-detached houses here, with an access to the rear, retaining the existing house, access to the rear, and 2 bungalows within the rear garden space, using the same policies that the objectors and the council have alluded to. I think I'm right in saying as a delegated decision, the officers resisted that as being out of character. That was taken to appeal, and as you can see in paragraph 9, the pair of semi-detached houses and 2 detached bungalows was refused under the scheme of delegation, and the appeal successfully defended, so that the appeal was dismissed. Subsequently, the applicant sought to have the pair of semi-detached houses and a single bungalow in the rear garden. Again, officers on the scheme of delegation took a view that this was inappropriate development, was out of character with context to seek development in depth into those long gardens, and formulated the view that development along the frontage, because of the fact that this is an area that's identified effectively for further development, we took the view that development should be retained along the frontage only, and that new residential habitable accommodation shouldn't be extending into those rear gardens. So development was limited to the frontage. So I think the point I'm making is I entirely agree with the that all of those policies that have been cited are wholly appropriate to apply to this site. However, the same officers that successfully defended the appeals in respect of the 2 bungalows in the rear and then the 1 bungalow in the rear are the officers that have looked at the same policies and concluded that this is an acceptable form of development. And whilst there is concern about the kind of accommodations coming forward, we have to keep going back to the adopted plan, since you are expected to make decisions in accordance with the provisions of the development plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. In this case, you have the Poole local plan, which is an up-to-date plan. You have the Broadstone neighbourhood plan, very up-to-date plan, and that is explicit that within the purple line shown on the drawing in front of you, within that urban area, there is an opportunity not to preserve large family housing, but an opportunity to deliver smaller 1 and 2 bed dwellings. Had this application come forward, I don't want to speculate, but at the other end of the street, outside of that zone, the weight of policy would not be there towards delivering new homes, 1 and 2 bedroom homes in this area. Therefore, having regard to exactly the same policies that have been cited at you for a reason for refusing the application, clearly the officers have looked at this and on the basis of entirely the same policies have concluded that this is an application that should be approved. It was really that, Jim, that I wanted to come back on, just that point about that the appeals were in respect of something quite different than the development that's before you today. This is frontage development, not the development in depth into the rear gardens of bungalows being built in the back gardens, and it's therefore substantially different. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Appreciate that. Councillor Stribley.
Thank you, Chairman. Am I first on the list?
You are indeed.
Okay. Thanks. I'll just pop my video on as well, so you can see I'm really here. I listened to the representations for and against with great diligence. Mr. Howells, who was speaking on behalf of who we heard speech on behalf of the proposal, was a Poole planning officer, for those who don't know him. And Mr. Ralph, who is a co-signatory to the objectors, was for many years one of Poole's most senior planning officers too. So I give considerable weight to both arguments in that respect. I have to say I almost totally agree with the ward councillor on what he said about this on Councillor Brooke, in that I dislike it intensely. I'm really sorry that there is already permission for 6 flats on part of the plot. I'm very concerned that this application now overlaps that previous and is in effect joining up, because I do wonder if we'd had the application for 12 flats on the total plot, whether we would be in exactly the same position, and I doubt it. I don't like the large quantity of parking in the rear garden, which is covering a great central point of that rear garden. I think that's unneighbourly. And while in some respects I'm pleased to know that there are 18 parking spaces for these 12 proposed flats, this is in the inner zone of Broadstone, easy walk to the shopping centre, etc., etc. So why does it need 50% more parking spaces than 2 applications we've just looked at in Parkston, where you just had 1 per flat and absolutely no visitor or extra parking whatsoever? So I really don't like the application. I don't like it when in the same ownership we get 2 adjacent applications, first one and then the other, because the plot has been severed for the application purposes. In our previous application, I think it's purposely to avoid any chance of affordable housing. I think on this one, we're not quite at the numbers to have a case for affordable housing, but I do think it tricks the planning committee into not looking, and the planning officers too, into not looking at the comprehensive site and what is likely to come forward. Just so in some ways there is, I think, excess parking on the site, and I think that's probably unknown for me ever to have suggested that. I think it will be out of context with the area, but as this is the identified inner zone of the Broadstone local plan or neighbourhood plan, I guess, can we be assured that such development could not in effect creep down beyond the purple line further along Clarendon and Upton Roads and all the others in the area, because I think that would be to the great detriment. There are already a lot of flats in and around the centre of Broadstone, and we all know that in fact flats are becoming less attractive to the general population, more difficult to sell. And I personally, if we had looked at the whole plot in together, there could have been a very much better comprehensive development of smaller individual or semi-detached dwellings. So I really don't like this one at all, but I'm not certain if there are sufficient planning reasons to refuse it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Stribley. I would hate to think that any member of this panel or any of our officers have been tricked in any way as to making their decisions and recommendations on any of our planning applications. I'm sure you only meant that in jest, Councillor Stribley. Mr. Evans, would you like to come back on anything?
Chairman, if I might, because there is a couple of points in there. The suggestion of creep beyond the purple line, clearly a line on a plan is a material planning consideration. Outside of this area, there is not that presumption. There is not a planning policy that says we will be seeking to provide 1 and 2 bedroom dwellings within this area, and therefore it's quite a different policy base that we will be judging the application against, and I wouldn't like to speculate on as to whether it would be acceptable elsewhere. We're dealing with it solely in the context of within this policy and in this location where the policy does presume this kind of development. Can I just touch on this question about, because clearly it's not dissimilar in some respects to sites being brought forward individually rather than comprehensively. This site has been brought forward incrementally, which the applicants are entirely entitled to do. And just to pick up the point from Councillor Stribley, had it come forward as a single site, then yes, it would have triggered a requirement for us to assess its viability against the possibility or the potential for it to make a contribution towards affordable housing. The applicants are entirely entitled to bring it forward in the manner they have done. They should not be vilified, and you shouldn't allow that to influence your decision. They've done nothing untoward, and this is a matter that the High Court has opined on some years ago in terms of whether this was a way of circumventing policy or whether it was something that land was a manner in which land was entitled to be brought forward, and the High Court opined on it, and that was the end of the matter. This is a site where they've done nothing untoward or underhand. They're using, if you like, the rules to their advantage, but that's just in the nature of these things, and they should not be penalised or vilified for having done so. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Evans.
Chairman, I wasn't suggesting they should. It's just the way things are, and it makes it very difficult, I think, for members. Thank you.
I understand, Councillor Stribley. Thank you. Councillor Trent.
Thank you, Chair. I find myself agreeing with a lot of what the Ward Councillor and Councillor Stribley says on this. I don't think the actual buildings themselves present too many problems, but the massive parking spaces and the complete loss of the greenness, when you compare that to the aerial photograph, it does make it very clear that it's changing the character of the area, and it's turning one bit in the middle of the area into a concrete lump where what surrounds it is green and tree lined. I do have to say that I really wish that it wasn't possible to split a site and have two applications and avoid other responsibilities. I really think that someone ought to challenge that again in High Court on a suitable case. But I think this is a case, and I do actually agree with the point that maybe if there was less parking to this development, then that might make it more possible to retain a little bit more greenness and perhaps plant a few trees and just generally maintain a corridor. So I am very uncertain about this. It is better than rear garden development, which seems to be appearing all over the place now. But as I say, the amount of parking, particularly in the rear garden, is, I think, excessive.
Chairman, might I just come back in just to clarify a point?
Please do.
On that. The discussion is very much focusing on the parking and the amount of hard surfacing in the rear garden. Can I just draw members' attention to the left-hand image, in the sense that the car parking at the front, this access way, this car parking is already approved. So the additional quantum of hard surfacing going into the rear area is the small little bit to access the cycle shed and the actual 6 parking spaces. The point being that this area, this access, these 3 spaces, and if you look at what's currently on the frontage of the house, some of which will be taken away with the closure of that access. So you are not considering the whole of the access, the whole of the parking over here, since you have already approved a large part of that, and the additional quantum is essentially that. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Members, do we have anyone else wishing to make any comments at this time, please? Councillor Hilliard?
Thank you, Chair. I obviously read the report and heard the discussion now, and yeah, from where I understood it, it was completely different to the rejected applications previously. So I move for approval.
Thank you, Councillor Hilliard. Do I have a seconder for Councillor Hilliard's move, please? I will second that. I listened very carefully to Councillor Brooks, who I have a great deal of thankfulness for with his planning knowledge. And I've also listened to Mr. Evans and read the reports very carefully. And I think that this is an application where we would lose if it went to appeal. And I think this is an application where we will need to accept this, although some of us may not quite like the parking, etc. I think the gaining of the flats will be outweighing of that in the inspector's eyes. So I will support the move, and I will second the move on behalf of Councillor Hilliard. Is there anyone else that would wish to speak before we move to a vote, please? No? In that case, I will go through the normal process of calling your names, and if you could indicate how you wish to vote, please. Thank you. Councillor McCormack, Vice Chairman.
For.
Councillor Bull.
For.
Councillor Bartlett.
For.
Councillor Davies.
For.
And Councillor Peter Hall. Councillor Hall. No answer. Councillor Hilliard.
For.
Councillor Johnson.
For.
Councillor Lapodovin.
For.
Sorry, Councillor Lawton.
For.
Councillor O'Neill.
For.
Councillor Stribley.
For.
Councillor Trent.
Against.
and myself, Councillor Kelsey, 4. Could I come back? Does Councillor Hall wish to take a vote? Councillor Hall, are you still with us? Mr. Tyler, I will take it that Councillor Hall is no longer in the meeting, and therefore I would ask you to give the results on those that have cast their votes.
Certainly, Chair. Thank you. So, to confirm, the number of votes for the motion is 11. The number of votes against the motion is 1, and there were no abstentions. So that motion has carried. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tyler. So thank you, members. That application is granted as per the officer's recommendation. And with that being noted, that is the final application for this afternoon's meeting. And I hereby close the meeting. I would ask members to stay online for a couple of minutes if they didn't mind, just so we can have a quick catch up.